So firstly, welcome to this morning's live webinar, Revisiting Myths About Carbon Pricing. So today is Friday, the 17th of February, 2023. I'm Jonathan Woodland. I'm the Head of Climate Diplomacy at the British Embassy, Seoul, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. The British Embassy, Seoul is delighted to be working with Next Group, an energy and environmental think tank dedicated to Korea's net zero energy transition. Next Group work closely with decision makers in the Korean government and industry, and they are one of a handful of think tanks in Korea specializing in data modeling and quantitative methodologies to conduct energy research policy. Next, recent research outcomes, the costs of climate action of emission-intensive companies in Korea, and 2050 carbon neutrality roadmap, the K-map scenario, detail ambitious sectoral roadmaps and receive much attention from the public sector and media. So we're delighted to work together. The United Kingdom legislated 2050 net zero nearly 4 years ago. Our decarbonisation journey is much longer than that. In the last 30 years or so, the UK has reduced its emissions by over 45%, and we're one of a growing number of nations who have proved definitively that it is possible to decouple economic growth and carbon emissions. Significant decarbonisation of the UK electricity system has been critical. In around a decade, we've gone from coal servicing 40% of UK electricity demand to 1.5% in 2022. In its place, gas has been essential, but the growing success story is UK offshore wind, which accounted for a record 26.8% of electricity generation in 2022. Like every nation, we have challenges in delivering net zero, decarbonising an ageing housing stock, and transitioning to electrified heating sit alongside industrial decarbonisation as the key challenges to overcome, with significant progress required this decade. The UK's example is instructive for a number of reasons. Firstly, our example demonstrates that many of the key technologies required to drive decarbonisation exist and can be deployed at scale. But this requires political will, allied with a number of examples of good policy implementation. The UK emissions trading scheme is the UK's principal market-based mechanism for putting a price on carbon. And we believe realistic carbon pricing has been key to our decarbonisation story to date. And it also will be instrumental in decarbonising a number of harder to abate sectors in our economy in the 2020s, 2030s and beyond. Because of our staunch domestic support for carbon pricing, the UK is urging both international ambition and consensus in the future of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is increasingly occupying a heightened profile in international fora. In recent weeks, the OECD launched their inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, the IFCMA, and we have discussions on carbon pricing ongoing in the G7, G20, the WTO, and the International Monetary Fund. And that's why this issue's brief on revisiting myths about carbon pricings comes at a really important moment, because it addresses a number of misunderstandings about carbon pricing. And it effectively busts the myth that carbon pricing hinders economic growth and limits jobs opportunities. The brief is available on the Next website, and I encourage you all to read it. But turning now to today's webinar, because we have two distinguished speakers joining us today. Jung is Senior Research Associate at Next Group and a principal author of Revisiting Myths About Carbon Pricing. Holding a PhD in public policy from Seoul National University, Jung's experience covers the public sector, public enterprise, NGOs, as well as a stint in the World Bank headquarters in Washington, DC. Fenella Aouane is the Head of Carbon Pricing Global Practice and Deputy Director of the Seoul headquartered international organization, the Global Green Growth Institute. Fenella has enjoyed a number of stints in international banking and has deep technical expertise in carbon markets, stemming back to around 2005 and the first EU emissions trading scheme. I'm looking forward to hearing presentations from both, likely to be around 15 minutes apiece. But first, two pieces of housekeeping. Can I ask audiences to please keep their microphones on mute and turn their video off, please? Please do place questions in the Q&A chat box. Korean or English is fine. We'll seek to address them once both presentations have concluded and during the Q&A. We have a hard finish at 11 o'clock this morning. But for now, I want to hand the floor to Jung, who is going to introduce the first presentation. Thank you.
네, 안녕하세요. 첫 번째 발표를 맡은 한정현입니다.
Yes, good morning. I'm Jung Han, going to give the first presentation. Before I begin, I will share how this research started. Jonathan talked about the significance this research and study has for the UK and the International Carbon Pricing Initiative, and it has great significance to Korea as well. Korea is about to draft a detailed NCT implementation plan and establish fourth emission trading system. But still, some stakeholders are still negative and skeptical about carbon pricing, fearing that it will negatively impact economic indicators. So next group decided to take a closer look at the existing studies on carbon pricing and to reconsider various concerns and possibilities regarding the macroeconomic effect of carbon pricing. So therefore, my presentation today is not on the result of the research directly conducted by NEXT, but on the review paper that analyzed existing literature on carbon pricing. With this project as a starting point, NEXT is planning to build a simulation model for carbon prices in Korea. And I would like to thank the British Embassy Seoul for understanding the purpose of the project and providing financial support. So today's presentation will first briefly review the current status of the introduction of global carbon pricing system. And based on the previous studies, we'll revisit two main concerns about the introduction of the carbon pricing system and the empirical studies to shed light on limitation of existing studies. We'll also examine when low carbon technology transitions and entry of new forms are included in the economic model, how the effect of GDP, employment, and carbon tax rates will change. We'll also talk about the implication to the government and companies. As carbon reduction becomes a global issue, attempts to put a price on carbon are increasing. As of April 2022, 68 countries or regions have introduced carbon taxes or emission trading systems. But the emission covered by these carbon pricing instruments are only 23% of the global emission, and the current carbon price is extremely low to help achieve the Paris Agreement goals. Also, while market-based approaches such as emission trading scheme have been steadily increasing since the early 2000s, carbon taxes have not yet become binding regulations in most countries. On the map, red color indicates the area where ETS is implemented or planned to be introduced, but blue is the area where the carbon taxes are operated or introduced, is about to be introduced. Blue is visibly smaller than red. Economists generally agree that putting a price on carbon is the most efficient way to reduce carbon. However, it is not easy to do because many people are concerned that carbon pricing will have a negative impact on macroeconomy, so economic growth and job creation. So two of the most common misperceptions were looked at in several studies in the past, but most of these studies were done by CGE, Computational General Equilibrium Model. So as a result, most of them predict a decline in GDP. For example, according to a study done by IMF, the GDP would fall by up to 4.5% by 2050 when carbon pricing is introduced. However, empirical studies yielded very different results from previous simulation studies. Using the numerical data from Europe and British Columbia, Canada, which have long history of carbon pricing, it was confirmed that the carbon taxes or ETS had no effect on economic growth or employment, or rather increased it. For example, in Metcalfe and Stock research, according to the research result, average in the second year of the introduction of carbon pricing in Europe, GDP growth rate and employment rate was 0.2 percentage point and 0.5 percentage point respectively, and fell slightly in the fourth year, but turned positive again from the fifth year. The difference between the prediction model and empirical study result is because both negative and positive effects and aspects exist in the economic impact of the carbon emission regulation. As past forecasting models have confirmed, increase in carbon price can certainly dampen consumption, investment, and exports. However, in the process of transitioning to a low-carbon economy and expansion of eco-friendly investment, growth of new industries can have a positive impact on the real economy. And depending on how many new jobs are created in this process, the net effect on employment can be also different. However, in most of the preceding studies done by CGE methodology, this possibility was not included in the economic model. And some models have limitations in not only properly reflecting the real economy, because the unrealistic assumptions such as full employment was made. So in order to more accurately analyze the macroeconomic effect of the carbon pricing system, we need to analyze the economic model by introducing companies' transition to low carbon technology and new companies entering into the market.
Recent study on the US regarding the macroeconomic effect on carbon pricing showed that unless we consider the green tech adoption of firms and new firm entry in the market, the adverse impact on GDP growth and employment can be overestimated. The study assumes that the US implements CPI that can induce 35% reduction over 2020 levels by 2050. Once a firm enters a market, it can choose its production technology mix. There's polluting technology that emits carbon during production, faces carbon tax on emissions, but firms can spend money to reduce emissions. The other is green technology, free of carbon emissions, but incurs fixed costs related to adopting the technology. For example, POSCO of Korea has the option to produce steel with fossil fuel or renewables. The former will emit great amounts of carbon, leading to carbon tax. However, if POSCO uses renewables or uses hydrogen reduction steelmaking, the green technology will be free of carbon taxes, but it will have to make capex investment to use renewables. Due to the presence of labor market friction, there will be a short-term unemployment of job seekers, which is inevitable. And another assumption is that carbon tax revenues are all transferred to households. Based on the three assumptions, three different models are compared. First, the benchmark model considers both green tech adoption and new firm entry. The no firm entry models does not consider the entry of new firms, but only considers the adoption of green technology by new existing firms. For example, in the benchmark model, POSCO and Samsung existing companies can realize RE100, and at the same time, new entry firms can choose green technology. But with no firm entry model, there's no new firm in the market, so only existing companies will pursue RE100. With the no entry, no technology adoption model, it does not consider both entry and technical adoption. Samsung and POSCO will continue emitting carbon and paying carbon tax to continue its production. There's no new entry, so of course there's no additional technology adoption in the market. In other words, the last model shuts down all possibilities of a fundamental economy-wide change in production technology structures. As you see in the graph, you can see the impact of carbon tax. In the case of benchmark and no entry model, total output and consumption increases despite the rise of carbon price. Unemployment increases in the short term, but will be stabilized in the long term. In the no entry and no tech adoption model, due to the carbon tax, total output and consumption will plunge and unemployment will rise continuously. This is because carbon prices induce firms to move more toward green technology. So with higher carbon taxes, it will be more expensive to use polluting technology. So it's advantageous for firms to choose green technology. If more firms in the economy use green technology, they will offset productivity decrease of polluting firms, and total output in the economy will increase. In contrast to the no entry, no technology adopt model, Marginal cost of firms using polluting technology increases rapidly, and their employment and productivity will decrease fast. However, new entry and tech adoption is impossible, so decreased employment and output of these firms cannot be offset by increased output and employment of green firms. So the economy will experience a significant decline in total output, consumption, and employment. It's notable that total output increases the most with a no firm entry model. In other words, even without new entry, just with green tech adoption of existing firms, higher growth can be achieved easily. In terms of unemployment, we need to focus on two things. First is that unemployment increases, but only to a limited extent. If carbon price increases, more firms will adopt green technology, demanding more labor. That will lead to employment. So the rise in unemployment will be limited. Second is that the real wages of all employees and workers will increase slightly. If you look at the bottom two graphs, you can see that real wages of workers in green and polluting sectors increase. This will encourage more labor market participation, facilitate cross-sectoral job transition, and limit unemployment growth. The impact on carbon tax rate differ by model as well. If tech adoption and entry happens at the same time compared to otherwise, tax revenue to GDP ratio is only 1:5. So with technology adoption and new firm entry, we can achieve the same reduction with lower tax rates. This is a summary of this study. First of all, carbon pricing does not necessarily hamper economic growth. There are two adjustment mechanisms mainly chosen by companies, which are green tech adoption and new firm entry. So even with higher carbon prices, production and consumption can increase. And with polluting firms, employment will be transitioned to green firms, and this will increase labor market participation and limit unemployment rise. This is consistent with the recent empirical study result on the carbon pricing mechanism of Europe. And secondly, despite carbon price increases, the economy can grow and employment can rise as well, because companies will continuously move to green technology. So this implies that carbon price rises play an important role in changing the fundamental technology structure of the economy and facilitates policy-induced technology change. So with the stronger regulations such as Paris Agreement and SEEP, more Korean companies are moving to green technology, and we can see also new companies entering the market, including H2 Steel, Carbon Cure, and Greenery, which show the role of carbon price in the market. Now let me talk about the implication for the government and companies. First of all, in order to encourage green tech adoption, carbon pricing should be designed in a way it can provide a clear signal. Korea has the KETS, but due to the reallocation, the carbon price does not really reflect the actual carbon price. So the ETS is not an incentive, not a great incentive to help companies move toward green technology. So we need to reduce the ratio of reallocation and also strengthen the standard for maximum emission. So we need an overall improvement in the KETS to have the carbon price send a clear signal. And the revenues from carbon prices need to be recycled to make investments in new firm entry and green technology adoption. Under the KETS, carbon prices are volatile, so it creates a lot of instability for investments in green technology. The ROI period is very long and the amount is massive. That's why the US and EU has been coming up with various support measures. Korea could also use the revenue from carbon taxes to achieve carbon neutrality and also help companies that could be disadvantaged in this trend. It could also support SMEs to adopt green technology. Between 2019 and 2021, the 3-year cumulative auction revenue was around 850 billion won. So if we increase the level of auctions, we can gain more auction revenues and use this to help companies adopt more green technology. This is the implication for businesses. One important conclusion from this study is that polluting companies will not survive in the market due to decreased profitability. So they need to adopt internal carbon prices and internalize the cost of carbon to respond to carbon price increases in the market. This will help companies preclude investment in polluting businesses and naturally move their portfolio to green sectors. Companies with global sites can set internal carbon prices to be similar to the market to respond to the volatile market prices. KT&G also set their internal carbon price as 50,000 won recently, which is higher than the peak price of KEST. And with CBAM looming, the internal carbon price would be the most effective way to avoid customs taxes. So companies will be able to use the internal carbon price system to effectively manage various variables. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Jung, thanks so much for that really fascinating presentation. I mean, bringing together some of the economic data and talking a bit about kind of the real world implications and how companies are responding. So it's really, really fascinating. So thank you very much. Just a reminder to everybody in the audience listening today, do put your questions in the Q&A chat box. We won't come to them now. We'll come to them at the end of both presentations. But if there's any pressing points you want to raise on the back of Jung Hyun's comments just now, do start typing away. And now I'm going to hand over to Fenella, who's going to kind of talk a bit more about carbon pricing in a kind of international context. I'm sure Fenella will say 1 or 2 words about the Global Green Growth Institute, but a major international organization based in Seoul, and Fenella is the head of their carbon pricing unit, so very much involved in these debates. So Fenella, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, Jonathan. Shall I be sharing my screen, or are the organisers doing that?
I think you need to share your screen, Fenella.
Okie doke. That is no problem. Super. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you to the UK Embassy of Seoul for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I say good morning to you, not from Seoul, but from Jakarta. We are here talking to the government about international carbon trading and have been working with them for a number of years. So the topic is certainly very much live. I mean, a few reflections on the last presentation before I start, and on Jonathan's opening words. You know, the initial point is clearly a country, in order to meet the climate goals, should be trying to domestically reduce its emissions. And we've heard in the opening comments from Jonathan about how the UK has managed to reduce its emissions by 45%. And we've heard also that, you know, the myth buster, that emissions will not damage, or, you know, there is no need for emissions to damage jobs and economic growth. I might slightly play devil's advocate for that, because it depends how you price carbon. So controversially, if we look at this, if you look at, for example, the US Inflation Reduction Act, that now has created $10 billion worth of tax credits for US citizens to invest in green technology, which is great on the surface, but underneath, what does that do for international trade? So what we've seen now is Hyun make an exceptionally large investment and start building solar panels in the US, which of course, how that affects jobs in Korea is perhaps different from pure ETS impact. So I think from that, the bit I want to concentrate on is how to look at pricing carbon through international carbon trading. And I stress this is to be used and is perceived to be used for, as Jonathan describes it, the harder to abate sectors. So these are the bits we really aren't able to solve through offshore wind farms or through energy efficiency. So let me give you a little bit of explanation. As Jonathan said, I am the head of carbon pricing. My name is Fenella Aouane, and my title is the head of carbon pricing at GGGI. Still very early here in Jakarta. Okay, so a little bit about who GGGI is. And thank you very much for saying we're a sort of formidable international organization. We are indeed a fully fledged international intergovernmental organization set up by treaty, but we are still very small in comparison with our peers like the UN and the World Bank. So we currently work on a membership basis, and we currently have 45 members actually now. So we have offices in about 39 countries. And our purpose is to support our members to transform their economies to a green growth model. So very much in line with the whole ethos of carbon pricing, reducing emissions. We do our work through policy advisories and through helping countries access green finance, as we call it. And we see green finance as being the collective of climate finance, so the concessional lending and investment, and then carbon finance, which is the area that I look at, which is the international sale of the emission reductions between countries. So we sit within the government. So our role is very much conversing with government. So any of you on the line from the private sector, that probably is why you may not have heard of us so far. Right, so let me give a slight overview to where are we in carbon pricing in Korea, and where does international carbon trading fit in? So at the moment, as described in the previous presentation, Korea has made both domestic and international commitments. So under the international climate agreements, so I'll explain what those are shortly. It's made a commitment to reduce its emissions. It's also made a domestic commitment to go net zero and internationally. And the way it's doing that is mainly through individual bespoke steps, but also through the use of an emission trading scheme. And that emission trading scheme covers 73% of all emissions in Korea. It's currently on its third phase. Quite importantly, for what I'm going to speak about, I'll talk about the flexibility and the linking. So how purely national is this scheme compared with its ability to accept international trades? And the idea is that it's slightly flexible in the sense that it's not linked with another scheme. So you can't buy and sell in, for example, the Chinese ETS and use those for any commitments in the Korean ETS or with Europe or anything. So it is on its own, but it does allow the use of what we call offsets. So if there is an emission reducing activity somewhere else in Korea, whether that be related to cook stoves, energy efficiency, etc., a regulated entity could buy those and use those reductions as part of its commitment. And it does, for a very small amount, also allow international credits through the scheme. And then what we see going forward, and what we see the signal is that the Korean NDC, the international commitment, does have a sector for overseas reduction. So it does allow the use of, or it predicts that there will be the use of international credits. So as said, Korea has an NDC commitment, but it also has the net zero commitment. So it needs to do more than it is currently doing. So how is it going to do that? So there's a number of ways of doing that. And if you have a net zero target, admittedly barring the forest, which will be a sink, effectively you have to have all emitting entities virtually having a target of 0. So that's clearly very difficult for hard to abate sectors, but you can expand the scope of the ETS to cover more than 73%. You can lower the thresholds, you increase the auction allocation to create funding to do activities elsewhere. And importantly here, you can increase the amount of flexibility ratio, meaning you may allow more international activities to be imported into Korea. And that's through what we're calling Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So let me go on and explain a little bit about what Article 6 is for those that are not familiar with it. And I apologize for those that are completely familiar with it. It's a little difficult to predict who knows and who doesn't know. So I always prefer to make it simpler rather than more complicated. So please zone out, go get yourself a drink of water if you're very familiar with the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was the international climate agreement that countries dealt under or were making commitments to up until 2020. And this had the philosophy that effectively developed countries were called Annex 1 countries, and they had targets. And then the developing countries were countries with no targets because it was seen that they were developing. So there was a slight misbalance, and particularly that was pertinent for countries such as Korea initially, where there was a little bit of a balance as to which side of the targets they sat. So the ways to reduce emissions for the developed countries was using the emission trading schemes. And then the international trade was under a scheme called the Clean Development Mechanism, or sometimes joint implementation, depending geographically where you were. And what that allowed for was trade from a non-Annex 1 country, so let's say South Africa, to an Annex 1 country, say Germany. And so Germany couldn't reduce its emissions anymore. So instead, what it did was purchase the emission reductions from South Africa and use that in Germany. So globally, emissions reduced, which is good, but it was seen as imperfect in the premise that it didn't actually, there was a little too much open for Germany not to try very hard at reducing their emissions and simply to rely on trading. The agreement type that was used between countries was called an Emission Reduction Purchase Agreement, or ERPA. So now under Paris, that was committed to in 2015, that every country has a commitment. So that means that Korea has a commitment, France has a commitment, Germany has a commitment, and so does South Africa, Colombia, Senegal, Vietnam, Indonesia. But the idea is it's all nationally determined. So Indonesia says, look, we feel we can reduce our emissions by 29% unconditionally. And they have committed to that. But different countries will say we will reduce our emissions by 50%, by 12%, whatever they feel that they can commit to. And trade can happen between countries. So if Indonesia is being more successful than it originally anticipated and it's reducing emissions by more than 29%, or there's the potential for it to, then you can trade that additional credit over to another country that's finding it hard. For example, in the European or North Asian, so Korean, Japanese, hard to abate sectors, they can purchase those credits. And we trade under what we call a MOPA, or a mitigation outcome purchase agreement. It's the same thing as a purchase, different terminology, different agreements. So Article 6, it's a very small article with certain points as 6.2 and 6.4. So what's the difference and how does it work? And why do we want it to work? So with these NDCs, we've all promised to reduce, and we can carry out what we call voluntary cooperation or cooperative approaches. For those in the private sector, I'll translate that to trading. And cooperative approaches are seen by the International Emission Trading Association with the University of Maryland, did a study in 2019, and they reckoned that the cost of meeting the national goals could reduce by 50% if international trading is used to its most effect. There are two ways of doing it. It can be done directly. All international trade, by the way, happens under 6.2. It's whether you add also a mechanism that will be available from 2025, not yet, it's being designed under the what they call the Sustainable Development Mechanism. So there are two, whether you work through a central body, which will be governed by the UNFCCC, or whether you work directly. It's important to think, why do we need to do this? Because there are more reasons than just because my government wants to reduce its emissions under its international goals. For a company, and I shall randomly pick one from Korea, and I shall randomly pick one that has an English word as its title, because then I won't be embarrassed about pronouncing it incorrectly. So if I say Samsung, for example, they want to sell telephones to French people, British people, Spaniards, anybody, anywhere in the world. There is an issue that in order for fair competition, the EU is making phone manufacturers from Nokia to, I can't think of many European phone manufacturers, but others in Europe to reduce their emissions aggressively. So if a Samsung phone comes into Europe and the aggression on the emissions created in the manufacture of that phone are less, it could mean that Samsung phones are cheaper than the locally made phones. So they will price out the competition. So to even this up, the European Union is now bringing in a border tax. And it is effectively a carbon border tax. So it is saying, if you have not reduced, mitigated the emissions in the production of your goods, you will be taxed as you bring them into Europe. Or, as I said at the beginning, a US subsidy on green goods. Now, that's slightly more troublesome, because it's a tax rather than a trade, but it is interesting in that aspect, in the sense of how it works. I'm thinking Jonathan's come on the screen because he's going to tell me to hurry up, I presume.
Thanks, Fenella. Yes, I am. If you can, sure. Perhaps just 2 to 3 more minutes. Thank you.
Of course, of course. So what I'll do is I'll skip through this. Where are we at the moment, and where's Article 6? You can see there are several countries that are making agreements across the globe. So South Korea is one of them. We can see a few countries have made considerable progress. Nothing has actually moved with regard to an ITMO, an internationally transferred mitigation outcome as yet, but agreements are in place with a few countries. And GGGI, we are dealing in around 10, 12 countries. We have over 30 million in technical assistance to help these countries set up to trade. And lastly, I should just say, there are different ways that Korea can take part in international trading. There's a Japanese model, which is very much around technology sharing. And that focuses quite a lot on investment. Our fear with that model is that it takes a very long time to generate the ITMOs, and we only have until 2030. And as you can see there, Korea has a commitment to buy 33.5 million tons by 2030. So there is also a Swiss model, or Sweden is also looking at this, where the purpose is very much only to buy the ITMOs rather than look at the investment purpose. And so therefore you can maybe target slightly more mature activities and have a quicker generation. So we would effectively recommend that both models are used by Korea in order to have the best chance to purchase the volume. But I'm interested to understand questions coming in. I shall leave it there. Thank you, Jonathan.
Fenella, thanks so much for that really broad overview, and to just bring together the kind of international dynamics, including the trading aspects to the future of carbon pricing, which a number of countries, and Korea specifically, will probably need to address quite quickly. So thank you very much. I'm looking in the Q&A box at the moment, and it's currently empty. So do tell me if next colleagues, please do tell me if that's wrong and I'm looking at the wrong screen. If you're a member of the audience, do start typing in Korean or in English is fine. But we'll start I'll perhaps ask the first follow-up question. And Jung, this is kind of directed at you, I think, in the first instance. So many of the findings from the paper that you've presented and the presentation today resonate with the lived experience of the UK. So we see in the UK, we see carbon pricing as a really cost-efficient way to support the net zero transition at an economy-wide scale. And I think one of your PPT slides pointed out the fairly high price of carbon in the UK at the moment, I think around $70 or so. Equally, at the same time, the UK has deployed a number of non-pricing policy mechanisms. So, for example, we've announced a political commitment to end the burning of coal in 2024. We've announced a political commitment to ban the sale of internal combustion engines in 2030 in cars and vans. Jung, what are your hopes for the launch of Korea's carbon neutrality roadmap in late March? And what is the right balance of market-based pricing mechanisms, i.e. via the ETS, as opposed to non-price-based mechanisms, so political statements around coal phase out or ICE phase out? Over to you. Thank you.
네, 먼저 첫 번째 질문에 답변을 드리면
So to answer your first
3월에 발표되는 NDC
question,
로드맵과 탄소 중립 기본법은 향후
the
20년간
NDC roadmap that will be announced in March, and the Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality will be the kind of overarching law that will determine the direction of Korea's carbon neutrality for the next 20 years. So it needs to have action plans. Korea only has official reduction goals for 2030 and 2050. We don't have an interim reduction pathway. So there should be a more detailed plan for each year. And for annual reduction goals, we need to come up with tasks and also ways to fund these activities in the plan. And regarding the balance between market-based pricing mechanisms and non-price-based policies, of course, both are important. In terms of price-based policies, they're important in that it sends a clear signal of carbon price increase to actors, thereby inducing immediate behavioral change. But political commitment and other non-price-based mechanisms are also crucial, since it helps predict the direction of government policies and has a binding effect for the state as well. But in terms of achieving net zero in Korea, at this point, I think price-based mechanisms should be the focus. We already have many policy goals for net zero, and now it's up to the actors to realize this goal. So carbon price needs to be determined at a reasonable level to impact actors' decisions and behaviors.
Jung, thanks so much, hugely appreciated. So we're going to turn now to the Q&A box, and I think the first question, Fenella, is for you, and I think it's probably, had I given you an extra 5 minutes during your presentation, you probably would have addressed this point. But can you talk about some of the specific projects or roles GGGI is working on to implement kind of Article 6? Thank you.
Sure, and yeah, my problem is trying to keep to 15 minutes is never easy. Article 6 is not a small topic when you get into it. Of course, GGGI currently is working on a number of different programs. So not only are we working on, for example, looking at a series of biogas plants in Nepal for the Nepalese government to be able to add additional feedstocks, so some innovative feedstocks into that, which will further reduce emissions, and selling those to a government buyer, a potential government buyer in Europe. And in fact, I think I briefly alluded to that in one of the slides. That is, we're working with the Swedish government on that one. So that's an example of one of the projects. Then with regard to larger programs, one of the things that carbon pricing is meant to do is also to trigger transformational change. So we're trying to really push countries to help move towards green growth. And there we're looking at whole policy. So here in Indonesia, we're talking to the Indonesian government. They have in their NDC to domestically do some renewable energy, but we're actually talking to them about changing part of their feed-in tariff regulations for rooftop solar. So that's a whole national scheme with many, many, many individual projects underneath and helping to do that. The work, the activities that we carry out is not only helping to design that transaction and how we will measure the emission reductions, what the baseline is, what the conditions are of trade, but also very importantly, helping governments set up what we call the governance framework. So have they got the regulation in place that complies with the Paris Agreement? Have they got the processes and procedures in place and the responsible ministry? So that's generally the two sides that we work. And then our new carbon transaction platform will also look at fund management to help the actual process of trading, to try and accelerate that for both sellers and buyers. Thanks.
Fenella, thanks so much. I'm going to turn now to a question which I think is from somebody who's worked at GGGI in the past, so somebody you might potentially know. I'll turn to Jung in the first instance, though. The average carbon price in Korea has dropped in 2022 compared to the price in 2021, at the same time as Korea's talking about implementing its a much more ambitious NDC than might have been the case a couple of years ago. What is the main cause leading to this drop in carbon price? Jung, over to you. Welcome some thoughts, and then perhaps Fenella can chip in.
탄소 가격이 하락한 데는 여러 가지 이유가
So
있겠죠.
the decrease in carbon pricing can be attributable to many different reasons, but one major reason is the participation rate to the ETS market. The KETS market, when it is not really active, the carbon pricing is not realistically reflected to the market. So the carbon prices can drop. And because in Korea, free allocation ratio is very high, hindering the correct reflection of the realistic carbon pricing. I think that is one of the major reasons.
Thanks, Jung. Fenella, anything to add to that?
No, I agree. The government have allocated too many credits. They need to reduce the number of credits in circulation and the price will go up. Simple supply-demand dynamics.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks very much, both. Moving on to the next question then. So Korea is a compliance-based market, so it's impossible to import carbon emission units created from voluntary markets into the KETS system. Do you think this mechanism will be improved in the future? And if so, when do you think it will happen? Perhaps Fenella, do you want to have a go at that one in the first instance?
Sure, I'll try and be brief on that one. The voluntary market to compliance market opens up a whole webinar of its own, but I will be brief in the sense of, yes, it doesn't allow from voluntary market because voluntary market can be double counted, meaning the country that you're buying from may use those units for their climate commitments. So if Korea uses it as well, then the same reduction of 1 ton has been counted by 2 countries. So what you need to have is, as I showed in one of the slides, a corresponding adjustment. Same activity, same deal, effectively, but you need to put it under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And then the Korean government will use it for their climate commitment, and the seller government will not be able to use it for their climate commitment, at which point the seller government may not wish to sell it. So that is the challenge, is making sure that whatever you're doing in the voluntary market, the seller would be interested, the seller country would be willing to sell it and hasn't already got that activity as part of its own NDC activities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fenella. I'm going to turn to Jung with the next question. So very low prices in the KETS at the moment. And the view from one of our attendees is that this won't encourage decarbonisation. Is the Korean government considering putting a price floor to control the drop? So obviously, as you know, this is I think there's a discussion in the international arena about this. I think it's a carbon price floor is an IMF proposal. Jung, where do you think the Korean government is on this at the moment?
우선 탄소세가 가지고 있는 여러 가지
Yes. So there are numerous merits of carbon taxes. So the carbon prices are set. So the volatility of carbon price decreases. So it leads to better decision making by the different companies and private sector. And ETS is only applied to the participating organizations, but carbon taxes are applied to all the users and emitters of carbon. So it is more conducive to decarbonization. And as was mentioned, OECD and IMF broached the idea of international carbon price floor. But according to OECD, the industry and electricity sector takes up a lion's share of carbon emission. When carbon taxes are implemented, it can reduce emission. It is more effective in inducing decarbonization. But at the same time, ETS is operating and applying carbon taxes additionally. It requires more consensus making. So the consensus is not in full stage. So we need to have further discussion about this before it is implemented.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you both the 4-minute warning, and in a couple of minutes I'll be asking both of you to turn to some just final thoughts and comments about carbon pricing and next steps. But I'll turn the next question over to Fenella. Fenella, does GGGI provide grants to Korean project developers wanting to develop projects under Article 6.2? And how are you working with the Korean government and private sector in regards to these mechanisms? Thank you.
Sure. I wouldn't call it grants. What we may do is we may have calls for proposals going forward, especially under the carbon transaction platform. And that will be a call for activities that project developers may be doing in countries, so may be specific to countries. And with that, there may be a costed development payment. So it is not a grant as such, and that will be a competitive bidding process. So that would be effectively how we would deal with project developers. The private sector generally, our aim is to try and encourage the private sector. Our aim in all of our countries, all of our member countries, is to encourage the private sector to develop projects. So certainly that's part of our work, and to help them access finance either from carbon finance or carbon finance and climate finance where the attribution rules can be observed.
Great, thank you very much, Fenella. The final question, which I think we're probably going to be able to address today, well, quick thoughts from both of you, really. A number of Korean civil society members are concerned that Korea's new NDC will see an even higher target for obtaining carbon credits from international markets. Is this concern justified, or is it possible for the government to achieve such an ambitious carbon credit target? Jung, can I turn to you first for some thoughts on this one?
Yes, in just a second.
한국의 NDC가 달성하기 힘들다는 목표에 있어서
Yes, regarding the topic of attainability of Korean's NDC, what's important is we have to clearly understand that this is the direction that we need to take, and everyone has to exert efforts to obtain that target. Carbon pricing increase, pressure, and the drive for decarbonization is inevitable. We cannot escape that. And companies need to acknowledge the element of carbon pricing is something they have to also manage and prepare for, just like oil prices and other externalities. So although the carbon credit from overseas market and NDC attainment can be challenging, but what's important is how much we're going to cooperate and work towards that goal.
Thanks so much. So I think we've actually now come towards the end of today's session. So I'm going to ask you both for some final thoughts. Fenella, how do you see the next kind of couple of years panning out in terms of carbon pricing? What's going to happen over the next couple of years? How are leaders going to start tackling this, both in a kind of Korean context and an international context?
Sure. I want to slightly come back to civil society because I think that is crucially important. I think carbon pricing and civil society, carbon trading and civil society have not been comfortable bedfellows. And I think it is essentially important that we get comfortable with the activities of each party. Civil society is exceptionally important. They keep the check on, keep us all honest. And it's very important that Korea has ambitious goals, but each organization should have an internal price of carbon. Our view is, and this leads to your question around where do I think things are going in the next couple of years? I think the prices are going higher. So there will more easily than we've ever had before, there will more easily be a point where the price of buying a credit is higher than a company's cost of internally abating. So it will become naturally and commercially more viable for Korean organizations to adopt green energies and energy efficiency measures because the international price of buying a credit is too high. But we need to make sure that organizations are working out their internal cost of carbon in order to make this calculation sensibly. I leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fenella. I just a brief anecdote. I joined a meeting with a CEO of one of Korea's biggest companies earlier this week, who put an internal price of carbon at well over $100 amongst his kind of working thinking. So it's that definitely chimes with what I've heard from business leaders. Jung, final comments from you. So firstly, thank you for all the work on the report and the issues brief and comments today. What do you want to see as next steps from the Korean government?
우선은 한국에서는 앞서 말씀드렸다시피
So to begin with, as was mentioned, in Korea, ETS is the only carbon pricing mechanism. So ETS should be improved and carbon prices should be realized, set to the realistic level. And the revenue from ETS is the measure. It should be used in a way that most effectively reduce carbon emission. So the investment should be made in eco-friendly and carbon reduction technology. And I think that will help the Korea government to attain the goal of NDC.
Great, thank you very much. So that brings together an end to today's session. So can I say a few thank yous? Firstly to Next Group, and Jung in particular, for all her work on this. This is an issue which is going to remain incredibly important for all countries looking to decarbonize over the coming decades. And thank you very much to Fenella for getting up early to join us from Indonesia. And we look forward to perhaps speaking to Fenella when she returns to Seoul about some of these issues. So thank you very much from the British Embassy. It's been really great to get views. Sorry if there's one or two questions we've not been able to address today, but thank you very much for joining today's seminar. Thank you very much.